This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Katie Pellico, a producer for Where We Live. Every year, we air around 200 episodes of programming. As we round out 2023, we're looking back on some of our favorite conversations with the voices that moved us. On Thursday, our host Catherine Shen will share her picks, and Friday, you can tune in for senior producer Tess Terrible's favorites. So many of the shows we produced had to do with history, and the efforts to examine misperceptions, to lift up lesser-known angles of history, or to retell these stories. First up, we're going to listen back to our conversation with Daniel Hosang, a professor of ethnicity, race, and migration and American studies at Yale University. He's working with a team of students and scholars there to study the history of eugenics, the role the institution played in developing the pseudoscience, and more. He spoke with host Catherine Shen about the Anti-Eugenics Collective at Yale, but first started by defining the term eugenics.
Different people who would advocate for eugenics might have different accounts of it. The term itself comes from a British writer and researcher, academic, Francis Galton, in the kind of, right after as abolition is unfolding across the world. And he has this account that there can be a science in which you can direct kind of human evolution. So the self-direction of human evolution, and the term itself is often associated with that sense of an intentional kind of breeding, controlling the reproduction of humans. I should just say also, Galton is credited with contributing to many, many fields, statistics, meteorology, forms of mapping. He's also a really, really explicit white supremacist, someone who deeply supported colonial authority and rule. So the early history of this field is both tied up to mainstream social science disciplines and these very, very long histories of racial domination.
Well, you mentioned a very long history. Can you also talk about how this was embedded in society? How embedded was it in society?
Yeah, so in the early 20th century is really when the eugenics movement in the United States starts to accelerate. Actually, a Harvard-trained biologist goes to meet with Galton and brings back a letter from him, and which kind of authorizes him. And it really takes root in elite universities, Yale, Harvard, Stanford, Caltech on the West Coast. These eugenicists are focused on a number of policy areas, restricting immigration, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe, proliferating laws that allow states to involuntarily sterilize people. Some 80,000 people in this country are sterilized without their consent by the state. 60,000 in the name of eugenics, 20,000 in California alone. They're promoting laws that ban interracial marriage, that promote segregation, and really, as we'll talk more about, trying to advance eugenical ideas within universities through things like textbooks, courses, research grants, journals. So to really try to establish it as a respectable kind of mainstream academic field.
Well, and it's so interesting because with what sort of the list that you just went through, a lot of them are very familiar to us, I think, and we'll definitely be digging deeper into the afterlives, as we've said, about eugenics. Right now, I do want to talk a little bit about what you've discovered in your research. So can you tell us about Connecticut's 71st Governor Wilbur Cross, and his place in history, and what did you find from that research, and did anything surprise you there?
Yeah, and maybe we might just back up a little bit to set the context. There's been, lots of research. A historian at Yale, Dan Kevlis, wrote a really well-known book in 1985 in the name of eugenics. And there's a long, long body of scholarship that focuses on many, many, many of these figures. When I came to Yale 6 years ago, and I was teaching a class called Race, Politics, and the Law, and I had learned about some of this history in my time in California and Oregon about the connections between forced sterilizations and reproductive injustice, and I was curious about that history at Yale. And really, the only site that I found that really linked the university to this research was a student undergraduate thesis that was done in the mid-2010s. That really focused on how, especially in the early 1920s, when eugenics is increasingly under attack as a kind of pseudoscience, does it have any credibility? Is it just dressed up bigotry? a number of key faculty at Yale, the economist Irving Fisher, the president at the time, James Rowland Angel, a geographer named Ellsworth Huntington, offered to bring the American Eugenics Society, the newly created American Eugenics Society, to New Haven. And they set up the office on the New Haven Green at 185 Church Street. At that time, Wilbur Cross is the dean of the graduate school at Yale. He's a literary scholar. He retires in 1930, runs for governor soon after. And when he's in office in the mid-1930s, he commissions this study called the Survey of Human Resources in Connecticut. And he turns to the most kind of racist faction of the eugenicist movement, the Eugenics Record Office, to carry out a survey of every town in Connecticut for the purposes of dividing the population between those who are, quote, adequate and those who are inadequate. And they go town by town to create these groupings, there's like 16 diagnostic categories that make someone inadequate. They set up their office at the state capitol, and then present a report 2 years later. And the chilling part of this report is it not only advocates for sterilization and institutionalization, but even cites potentially euthanasia as one possible remedy to deal with a, quote, inadequate people of the state of Connecticut.
And well, you just built up so much information, and you said chilling 3 times. So that makes me semi excited and also a little bit scared about what we're getting into later. But I want to get into Governor Cross later in the show for sure. But also want to dig more into Yale's role as well, because based on your research, I think you found there's some correspondence with Hitler as well. Was that surprising for you?
Oh, I mean, so, and these are, again, many of these documents have been, sometimes we call them, they're kind of hidden in plain sight. So other scholars have written about them. I think what's new about this project and many of the students who are engaged in it is thinking about the role of the university in particular and, higher education in general in helping to promote these ideas. So in the early 1930s, someone named Leon Whitney, who was the secretary of the American Eugenics Society, he's the one handling all the correspondence coming out of their office on the New Haven Green. And he writes a book called The Case for Sterilization. And it's really trying to advocate the uptake of large programs of sterilization all over the country in the name of eugenics. And he writes in his unpublished autobiography, he writes this many years later, 1970, that after this book comes out, he says, Hitler's henchmen write me a letter and they say, can you send me the book? And he's thrilled to send it to them. And then they send him a letter thanking him so much. And in his autobiography, he recalls very like a great sense of appreciation getting these letters from Hitler. And he says, I took my letter and I went to see the chairman of our immigration committee for the American Eugenics Society, another Yale alumni named Madison Grant, a notorious white supremacist. And he says, look at this letter I got from Hitler commending me for my book. And in his recounting, Madison Grant reaches into his desk and says, well, look at the letter I got, him thanking me for my book, The Passing of the Great Race. So what was, particularly chilling about this is he's writing this in the late 1960s. So that it really, really challenges the idea that eugenics ideas, as horrible and painful as they are, simply withered on the vine after World War II, that there were people who were continually invested in them, and that U.S. universities and higher education played a really important role in laying the groundwork for the race science that the Nazis would take up.
Well, and honestly, based on what you just described, it changes my view of what book reviews are. Not to make light of this, but wow, I cannot imagine, being in that room, hearing this conversation. And so another thing we mentioned earlier, too, is the Anti-Eugenics Collective. Can you talk about why and when did Yale establish this collective and who was involved?
Yeah, so this is really, I have to just say, it's the student. So when I came across this undergraduate essay, I started incorporating it into some of our classes, lectures, discussions. And in, I think, 2021, a group of students came up to me and said, do you know more about this? Is there a way we can find out more about it? I really didn't. It was still during a lot of the pandemic-related shutdowns. And they said, well, what if we spend some time in the summer looking at some of these archives? And so a group of 5 students spent that initial summer doing that, taking images, trying to connect the dots. An amazing student did this diagram that kind of linked, named Dora Guo, linking together the different eugenics figures and the institutions they started. We started presenting the work that fall. I just then decided to build a seminar around it, and students in that seminar then conducted their own research. They hosted a tour of students from Naugatuck High School, a kind of anti-eugenics tour of the campus, built a website, and started doing lots of their own independent research. And so now we have collaborations with colleagues in psychiatry, at the Peabody Museum, helping to contextualize eugenics objects that are in their collections. And so it's really like just the beginning of trying to figure out together both kind of what happened and what its long impact is on the, forms of education that are kind of dominant today.
Well, and I love how organic I feel like the movement feels like, starting from students, and now we're having this conversation about it. And currently, in present day, has Yale been supportive of this process? What has that been like?
Yeah, I would, like every university, there's kind of many Yales. So there's colleagues in psychology, psychiatry, the history of science and medicine, our public humanities programs, who are all very, very eager to collaborate, learn more about this, kind of figure out how it's shaped the disciplines that they work in. Early on in the project, the students kind of talked to students and professors at other institutions who had kind of done these reckonings. So Stanford, University College London, UC Berkeley. And I think the message that we got was orient the work out towards the public, towards communities, towards teachers, that's really the kind of work of repair and education and awareness raising that needs to be done, rather than focusing it on a single statement from someone affiliated with the institution. And so the students, insisted that's the way we had to proceed, and that's the way we've gone.
And with the many Yales you mentioned too, with the many college towns, they're in towns and in cities. And I think one of the major themes that you look at, particularly in the ways that this legacy continues to live on, is how the study of eugenics shaped the university's relationship to New Haven, in our case here. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so this is several really wonderful students did kind of capstone projects on this, including a great researcher, Emmy Magliato. And what she discovered in looking at the archives is that by the late 1920s, Yale administrative leaders were aware that the term eugenics was increasingly difficult to defend in public discourse. And it's all in their archives. That by the late 1920s, after starting this American Eugenics Society, they say the word here is caution. We've got to proceed with caution. And so rather than, and they were being lobbied at the time actually to set up chairs, faculty chairs in eugenics with that explicit name. But they're increasingly aware you can't do that. In fact, they offer a position to an anthropologist from the Museum of Natural History, and he says the position he's offered is as a faculty member in racial psychology. He says, "Don't call me that; it's too controversial. Just call me a professor of anthropology." It's in the archives that students have found. So by the late 1920s, they're aware you can't use the term as explicitly, and they set up other kinds of institutions, including something called the Institute of Human Relations. And if you go to the building that housed it at 333 Cedar Street, you can still see those words in the ironwork there, although the Institute only lasted about 20 years. And they said, and Emmy found this out, New Haven will be our laboratory. And they started initiating all these studies that really took the kind of architecture of eugenics, but didn't use the term, trying to figure out superiority, inferiority, lots and lots of school-based surveys, et cetera. So Emmy argues that it really, really kind of set the terms for how universities, and including Yale, relate to the surrounding community.
So we also spoke with Dr. Marco Ramos, who's a psychiatrist at Yale School of Medicine and an assistant professor in the Yale History of Science and Medicine program, about this. Let's take a quick listen from him.
I think the other afterlife of this is that today, researchers from psychology, psychiatry, and honestly, sociology throughout the university still use the community of New Haven as a laboratory. The community of New Haven furnishes so much data for the production of knowledge and advancement careers of Yale professors and of Yale trainees. And our pedagogy increasingly is asking trainees to become critical of that relationship and say, to what extent is my research advancing my interest versus the community that I'm supposed to be serving? Whose voices are getting represented in this kind of research is one really, really important question. One of the other angles that often gets explored when this comes up with community, and this is particularly for the medical trainees, they often go into the community thinking, oh, community members are going to welcome me with open arms because I'm here to help. And I joined medicine because I want to help, right? I want to care for people. But when they actually enter the community with their Yale white coats, they're often met with suspicion, in some cases, outright hostility or resistance. And the classroom has come a place for us in this curriculum to unpack that and say, why is that the case, right? And the default answer for organized medicine for a long time was to say something like, oh, the community has a lack of health literacy, they have a lack of health education. This basically a form of gaslighting, to be honest, where they're essentially arguing they don't know what's good for them. This history uncovers that they're suspicious of Yale University for legit reasons, like grounded in Yale's marginalization of these communities. And so when you go into them as a researcher or as a clinician, right, you should expect to be met with that given the institution that you're representing and its history with the community.
So Dr. Ramos really had a lot to say there, and there's so much, I think, to unpack. But Dan, can you touch on this process of rethinking presumptions of good around these studies, as well as sort of the history of harm and the memory of that harm in New Haven?
Yeah, I mean, we often want to tell ourselves the stories about all of our fields, that it's just a continuous process of improvement, scientific research and innovation over time. And, part of what our colleagues in psychiatry are pointing out is all fields, all of these fields, the psychiatry program at Yale is no different than many, many others. It's founded in the late 1920s. The dean of the medical school at the time, Milton Winternitz, was a board member of the American Eugenics Society. The founding director of that program was recruited from Munich and worked closely with, the leading race scientists in Germany, and had these deep, deep beliefs in what was called kind of hereditarian psychiatry, the idea that the differences you observe in people's cognition and mental health are explained by the body and by inheritance. And so while he didn't, Dr. Kahn, the founding director, didn't directly transpose all of those ideas, it was clearly part of a framework. Now, I am, for myself, and I think many of the residents, less interested in kind of this as an indictment or a historical adjudication over good versus bad, but instead saying we can't just tell ourselves these simplistic stories about our fields. We actually have to think about the complexity, the possibility that our fields also are capable of harm. And I don't just mean to single out psychiatry or psychology, those kind of mental health fields. It's all fields. And I think we can do better at training students, engaging colleagues with this history, so that we not only kind of don't repeat these frameworks and ideas, but actually we can strengthen like the reasons that we want people to get into medicine, to help people, to care for people. That's partly what's at stake here as well.
Right. And I think with what you just said, too, it's a conversation that I feel like if you take the academic out of it, it's the same conversation in other industries. Like you say, it touches on so many different areas. And you mentioned this a little bit earlier, too, but can we talk about what does institutional apologies look like?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, because part of what we saw when you go into the archives here is all the work that they needed to do to try to make eugenics appealing to others. So they sponsored sermon contests for local clergy. They sponsored fitter family contests, where at local state and county fairs where people enter livestock, the best chicken, the best pig. You would also enter your family, small, medium, and large. And eugenic field workers would measure your face and ask you questions about your health history and pedigree and award a medal designed here in New Haven to the winners of this fitter family. Textbooks, lots and lots of speakers tours. So they put out into the world many of these ideas that legitimated hierarchy, they legitimated humiliation, they legitimated segregation. And so for, I think, many of us, what kind of reconciliation and repair looks like is to now both acknowledge that history, but also think about what is an anti-eugenic world? What's a world where everyone is entitled to dignity, where we imagine that people can, there's abundance around us, and that it can shape the way we do many, many fields. So that's all to say that I think that's the kind of repair versus the kind where we make an acknowledgement, but then kind of firmly situated in the past, something that happened long ago that we're simply saying we feel sorry about. And I think what we want to think about is how can we orient this towards repair in the world we live in today.
That was Daniel Hosang, professor of ethnicity, race, and migration and American studies at Yale University. That full episode is linked on our website at ctpublic.org/wherewelive. Coming up, we hear about how the story of Thanksgiving is being retold, centering Indigenous voices where we live. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Katie Pellico. This hour, we're listening back to some of our favorite conversations on Where We Live in 2023. Last month, we got to hear from Chris Newell, a Connecticut-based educator and a member of the Passamaquoddy tribe. He recently wrote a book for children all about the real story of Thanksgiving. If You Lived During the Plymouth Thanksgiving is written for grades 2 through 5, but it can be helpful for readers of all ages. It was the first in Scholastic's revival of its 70s-era If You Lived During series. Here he is with host Catherine Shen describing how the idea for this book came to be.
Growing up in my community in Madocnigook, we were not taught the first Thanksgiving narrative. I mean, we celebrated the Thanksgiving holiday. It was a day off. It was a national holiday. All of our families would get together for, a feast, much resemblant of the American Thanksgiving holiday. But we were not taught the Pilgrim narrative. It wasn't something I really ran into until I left the reservation and started going to high school off the reservation, that I realized that America taught this narrative as, basically the beginning of America. And that really, from my perspective, even at that age, it felt really off, right? Because I know my ancestors have been living in what is the Dawnland for 12,000 plus years. It's like when you teach the Pilgrim narrative, you start the time clock with the arrival of the Mayflower in 1620, as if nothing happened before. And so for me, it was a personal journey on my part, but also for Wampanoag people. I mean, you got to understand, I'm Passamaquoddy, I'm not Wampanoag, so this is not my history. It's just history that I've been working with for quite a long time. For Wampanoag people, they experience something even more drastic, in that the Pilgrim narrative, what it does is it tends to put them in the past tense. And so in 2023, it is not uncommon for a Wampanoag person to experience meeting a new person, a non-native person, and for them to be surprised that the Wampanoag person is alive, that they're even here. That's the level of education that the average American often has as a result of these foundational myths. And so, it's a frustrating experience for Wampanoag people to go through, even in their own homelands, and have to experience that. And I truly wanted to make, create a book that was not to please Scholastic. But I was thinking of all of my Wampanoag friends and relatives who experienced that, and this is their history, and I wanted to be very careful with it. But I also wanted to put them back into the present and tell some real truths, so that the silly questions that they sometimes get, that we think would be basic knowledge, they wouldn't get anymore, because their children would have this resource and would have those questions already answered prior. So, children reading this book tend to be a little bit more educated than their parents and their grandparents, because this has been taught in a certain way since the 19th century. And that's one of the things I was hoping to help undo.
And we appreciate you making that clarification too, because it's important to recognize that there are so many different voices with this storytelling. And speaking of education and the function that this book can play, we wanted to let Mohegan member and director of curriculum Sam Tondreau shout out your book and tell us why she uses it in the classroom in her own words. So let's take a listen here.
I've worked with a lot of school districts, and I recommend Chris Newell's book for many reasons. I have so many thoughts. I'll share a few, but I really like how he took the approach of sharing topics such as language, lifeways of the Wampanoag people in the 1600s, because the perspectives of our Native peoples in books in the classroom are missing. By learning from the Wampanoag people, we're learning from the group of people, and from a group of people that are still thriving in communities today. Winona Nelson, the illustrator, did such an amazing job creating accurate portrayals of what Northeast Woodland area tribes would look like. More specifically, the homes that we lived in, the garb that we wore, and the involvement of children. I really liked the involvement of children throughout the book, and it's very inspirational for our tribal communities. I also like, too, how he brought into a younger age group the topics of alliances, challenges, and misconceptions into the classroom, because we can really teach our students in a deeper perspective at a younger age.
Chris, would love to hear your response to what Sam has to say here, and especially the collaboration you did with the book's illustrator, Winona Nelson.
Yeah, I love Sam's words. And, Sam, if you're listening, thank you for those. First I'll talk about Winona, the illustrator. She's Leech Lake Band Ojibwe. And I agree with Sam's assertion that she did her homework when it comes to, as an Ojibwe person, she's a Great Lakes tribe. She's not from this region either. And she did her homework as far as depicting what Native peoples, at the time period looked like, dressed like, to the point where even in another review by Dr. Debbie Reese, she points out very wisely that all of the Native people have shoes on. They all have moccasins on. They all have shoes on. Their feet are covered, where typically in children's picture books, Native peoples are depicted without shoes. And that's one of Debbie Reese's biggest qualms about depictions about Native people. So I appreciate that, she sees, what I was going for, and what Winona was going for, in that we were trying to create a resource that, would work not just for children, but also for teachers, especially, as I had teachers in mind as an audience, and that, the story delves a little bit deeper, right? It expands the lens beyond the feast itself to what happened before and what happened after. And that is a valuable tool for a lot of people.
Well, and it's clear that there was so much research behind your work here with the book. And can you talk about also the process that you worked alongside a representative of the Wampanoag tribe to make sure that this is all accurate?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I actually began with this material when I worked at the Pequot Museum. I was the head of education there. And, there's a common, misconception sometimes that the modern day Thanksgiving holiday has to do with the Pequot Massacre. And that comes from an actual piece of history where after the Pequot Massacre in 1637, the governor of the Mass Bay Colony, John Winthrop, would declare what was called an English Day of Thanksgiving, which was a day of prayer and fasting in celebration of the massacre of the Pequots. And so when I started working with this material, it was really because at the Pequot Museum, we had a lot of people confused, between the Mayflower landing and the Pequot massacre and the Thanksgiving holiday. So I created a educational program for students called Demystifying Thanksgiving. And in the research for that's where I learned about Sarah Josepha Hale and the creation of the narrative, by fiction writers, essentially in the 1800s, and Alexander Young's footnote that first identified the feast as the quote unquote first Thanksgiving. That's the first time it was ever done. It was in 1841. So this was years of research that I had done, and I presented this material for a few years at the Pequot Museum. But even then, when it came time to writing the book, I wanted to make sure to source from tribal sources. And so Linda Coombs, who you mentioned as my subject matter expert, is a Quina Wampanoag elder and an expert. And she has a new book called Colonization and the Wampanoag Story that's out right now, by the way. I'm just plugging that for her. I encourage you all to get it because she is, exactly what I wanted in that she's a hard grader. So in every edit, she had very specifics that she wanted to include in there, to make sure that we were indigenizing the story. And some of the sources I chose were things like the speech from Frank Wonsutta James, who in 1970 was invited to the 350th anniversary of the Mayflower landing, a Wampanoag person, a historian. And he had written a speech that included a whole lot of truth that was not being talked about at the time and was actually censored. He was not allowed to give his speech in Plymouth because it disrupted the Pilgrim narrative so badly. So I sourced a lot of things from Wampanoag sources, Linda Coombs being one, but also Frank Wonsutta James' speech, his censored speech from 1970.
So I want to get back to the book in a little bit, but you mentioned the program Demystifying Thanksgiving, which allowed you to encounter a very wide range of student and teacher responses to this content. So you just mentioned a few of them, but we'd love to sort of dig a little deeper about, what were some of the most common questions or misperceptions that you were able to identify through that experience?
I mean, it was a great testing ground for this material. I'm not before this project, I had not authored any books, or any, worked in children's books or anything like that. So working with this material for years with Demystifying Thanksgiving, I got to see, the students' reaction to the material as well as their teachers. And both of those things really informed, the method I took to writing and the audience that I was writing to. Because what I was seeing was the teachers were just as ignorant of this history as the students were, and were asking a lot of the same questions. A lot of times when I brought up the subject of Sarah Josepha Hale, we would end up in a discussion of her, and she's not a perfect person, but she's definitely somebody that America should know a little bit more about, because she's the first woman to be the editor of a large publication, Godey's Ladies Book, and she also wrote a little ditty that was known at the time as Mary Had a Lamb, which we all know today as Mary Had a Little Lamb. So it brings even histories like that are non-native histories even to light that have been hidden over all this time. And I found interest from the students and from the teachers on both sides of it, and really the reaction was a bit of surprise that how much they didn't know, up to that point, and leaving the experience of Demystifying Thanksgiving, they were often excited about how much they learned.
And so I definitely want to ask you in a little bit about teacher and student responses to the book, but I want to talk about first, too, that this was the first in Scholastics revisiting their If You Lived During series. And so this sort of served as an update of one of those books originally published in the 70s. So can you tell us about that process and also give us an idea of the title, because it was really important for you to do away with the word first Thanksgiving?
Yeah. say quote unquote first Thanksgiving for a lot of reasons, and that I go over it in the book very well. When it came to choosing the title, that was one of the things I wanted to change. And when it came to this book, being the first one involved in the rewrite of this series, which came out in the 70s, and initially all of the books were written by one author. And this time around, Scholastic is looking to have all of these books written by a diverse set of authors. And so that was one of the differences between this. Now, the original book, If You Live During the First Thanksgiving, actually, I had never seen a copy of it. And the editor, Katie Height, from Scholastic that I work with very well, and I love, the way her voice, advocated for my voice to, make sure to come through clearly in the book. She would not even send me a PDF copy of the original book because she was actually a bit ashamed about how it was written, how one-sided it was, and didn't want a copy or anything that would resemble something like that. She wanted something that was much more balanced, from the get-go. And so she didn't even send me an initial copy. She did send me some from If You Lived During the American Revolution, which she felt a little bit more comfortable about. So at least I got an idea of how the book goes, because this series, the way it's written, it's not chapters necessarily. They're all questions. Every chapter is a question. So there's 31 questions in the book. And a student can basically go to the table of contents if they want to look up specific information, look for a certain question, and then go to that page and find the information that they want, a few paragraphs about it, much like the introduction. Changing the name, to the Plymouth Thanksgiving, and then choosing the spelling. I'm going to go into that a little bit too. I wanted to get rid of that notion that the feast in 1621 was the first Thanksgiving, because once again, that was not a title given to that particular feast until 1841, when Alexander Young found a Plymouth plantation and Mort's relation and wrote about it. And in a footnote, called in citing a letter from Edward Winslow that had about a paragraph about it, and that's how unremarkable the feast was to the English. By the way, they only wrote about a paragraph about it. He would call it the first Thanksgiving because in the 1800s they were celebrating harvest feasts that they were calling Thanksgivings at the time. So he equated the two, and from then on, it became known as the first Thanksgiving. But that is a mistake of history, as I call out in the book. And that's something that I didn't want future students, to realize as they get into college, because that's a lot of times they go through this material in elementary school, even in high school, calling it the first Thanksgiving, and then they'll run into a historian in college who would teach them something different, and oftentimes it's a very jarring experience for them, and I didn't want young students to experience that anymore. And so that was one of my biggest motivations for changing the title and getting rid of first Thanksgiving.
That was Chris Newell, a Connecticut-based educator and a member of the Passamaquoddy tribe. Coming up, we'll hear a snippet of our show with the new Connecticut State Historian, Andy Horowitz. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Katie Pellico. In this final segment, we hear from the new Connecticut State Historian, Andy Horowitz. Here he is telling our host, Catherine Shen, about his earliest inklings of interest in Connecticut history.
Well, my mom recently unearthed from a box in the attic a book that I published when I was in third grade. By book, I should be clear, I mean it's some pieces of paper folded together. I think I had just gone on a school field trip to Sturbridge Village, and the book was called The Olden Times. So clearly there was something in me that was always drawn to history. I don't even remember writing that, but I'm putting it on my CV shortly.
You should.
Yeah, definitely. But I think, in terms of a kind of professional trajectory, it was really kind of three things that came together for me right around when I was in college. One was I had this great summer job starting in high school, actually, for the Department of Weights and Measures. And I realized this sounds like what does this have to do with history? But stay with me here. I had a weight kit of standardized weights, and it was my job every summer to check every scale in the city of New Haven where I was growing up to make sure that when you put your quarter pound of cheese on the scale, that it actually weighed a quarter pound instead of a third of a pound. Consumer protection. What this meant was that every summer for 3 years, I went down every street in the city of New Haven and went into every small grocery store, every deli, saw all the different kinds of foods that were for sale, all the different languages people were speaking, all the different accents people had. And it just made me think of New Haven as a place where the whole world was. It just made it endlessly fascinating to me. And then I stayed in New Haven for college, and all of a sudden all my classmates were from all over the country and even all over the world. And I became a kind of tour guide, suddenly the most interesting thing about me was that I was a townie, as they say.
Right.
So I got to show off these places that I was learning about in my summer job. And then it was really junior year of college. I think everybody who has any kind of happy story about their life, there's a teacher in the middle of it who kind of reoriented their trajectory. And for me, it was my history professor, Glenda Gilmore, who helped me get an internship at this place called the Southern Oral History Program at the University of North Carolina. And oral history basically just means interviewing people about their life experiences. And I got set up as a 20-year-old to interview this white civil rights activist who was in his 60s then, named Al McShirley. Al had been a radical in the 50s and 60s, and he was arrested, I think, twice for sedition for plotting to overthrow the Commonwealth of Kentucky, which he assured me later he was not trying to do. Overthrow capitalism, maybe, as he said to me, but not necessarily Kentucky. He had been surveilled by the FBI. It just gives you a sense of how radical he seemed in his time and place. And he was donating his FBI file to the university and wanted to tell his side of the story. So it was my job to sit in his living room for many, many hours and record his accounts of Stokely Carmichael and Marion Barry and these other giants of the civil rights movement. He had led a group of radical miners to the Poor People's Campaign in 1968 in Washington, D.C. And I just couldn't believe that I could sit in this man's living room and ask him questions about these, what to me were world historical events. So then when I came back to New Haven from that experience, knowing what oral history was, being so interested in learning about New Haven and telling stories about it, I went back to Professor Gilmore's office and she said, you should start an oral history project here in New Haven. And she and I did that together right after I graduated from college. And that's what really set me on this path.
Well, I just want to say I didn't realize that summer job existed.
Yeah, it's true. I had a badge even, which was really quite shouldn't have given me a badge. I'll just leave it at that.
I was going to say,
power.
We're 5 minutes into this conversation. I'm already learning so much. But I love your description about sort of your first getting your feet wet into becoming a historian, because it's very much like being a journalist, really. I've always thought it's my privilege for people to invite me into their homes or even to just take a moment and speak with me about their experience, whatever the experience may be. And I love that you mentioned the oral history aspect, because that plays a huge role in your sort of inspiration, and you continue to do so. So can you talk about oral history a bit? Because I think, ironically, we don't hear about it very much. Although I would say that that's kind of the beginning of a lot of history, how history is being recorded, right?
Yeah, that's right. So oral history, like I said, is really just about interviewing people about their life experiences, their firsthand account. And so, when I started the New Haven Oral History Project, the idea was simply I worked with Yale students to record interviews about just the living history of the city, stuff that people could remember. So we did interviews on everything from the Black Panther Party to the perfection of the pizza and sort of everything in between. And what's really special about oral history is that it lets you bring new people and topics and themes into the historical record. Historians often have relied on the kind of archival documents that only the rich and powerful leave behind. And oral history just totally unlocks that and allows us to think about the extraordinary significance of ordinary people. You don't really have to be famous for your life to be history. Mm-hmm. So I'll give you an example of one of the interviews we did. If there are any New Haven old-timers listening, they might remember Sidney Bruskin, who had a bicycle store on Chapel Street in New Haven. And one of my students was interviewing him about going to Hill House High School during the Depression. And Sid Bruskin was he was the son of Russian Jewish immigrants. He grew up in a neighborhood called Oak Street, which was a pretty tight, his couple of blocks, really tight-knit neighborhood of people, families like his, Jewish immigrants. So he told a story about being in the lunchroom at now the citywide high school and seeing other Jewish boys eat ham sandwiches. And, Jews, for kosher laws, they can't eat pork, they can't eat shellfish. So he just couldn't believe they were doing this. And he said he was sort of moved to try a bite of the sandwich. And at the end of that day, he said in the interview that he was afraid to go outside because he thought he was going to get struck by lightning. And, when you think about the sort of stories that the newspaper might report, there's not going to be a New Haven Register headline that says, boy eats ham sandwich, does not get struck by lightning. Like this is not a newsworthy story, but it certainly changed his life. And as historians, it gives us insight into these very, fundamental themes in American history about assimilation or acculturation, about how someone came into a new kind of consciousness of themselves in the crucible of the public school in the 1930s and the Great Depression. So it's an extraordinarily historically significant moment that we would really have no record of if my student had not sat there and just asked Sid Bruskin what it was like to go to school. So in a million ways like that, the Oral History Project, well, I shouldn't say a million, in 250 ways. We did around 250 interviews like that are all archived at Sterling Library at Yale and open to the public. And we use them to build that archive, but also to do public programs and museum exhibits. We did big exhibits on urban renewal in New Haven. We did one on the New Haven Holocaust Memorial. And it was all about just trying to open up the 20th century history of the city.
Well, and as you're sharing those anecdotes, I wonder if there is something to be said about hearing the voices, because that's certainly an appreciation that I started to have becoming a radio reporter, and now I'm sitting here having this conversation with you live on the radio, is you can't really capture the literal voice through writing, because I started as a newspaper reporter and I have been one for a very long time. And that's the appreciation that I got is hearing their cadence, hearing their emotions. So does oral history, does it capture something that textbooks don't? Why is it important to sort of continue having oral history?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's something to be said for hearing someone's voice. And in part, it's just more information. It gives you a sense of emotion and feeling. And, I think there's sometimes a sense that history is just what the rich and powerful do. It's an account of kings and presidents and kind of policy decisions. I think we've moved away from that over the past decades, but it still lingers as the kind of disciplinary baggage of history, the study of history. And getting to hear people who are more or less like you and me talk in voices that are more or less yours and mine with emotions that we can relate to, even as they may be, historical situations that are very distant from our own. I think they just remind us that history is real.
Right. And we want to get into more of what you study later, but I want to ask first, when we think about state history, when we think about history in general, I think we tend to think hundreds of years, thousands of years, but you're looking at more modern history, which is still history. So why do you think deep history is considered more valid by some?
Yeah, there is kind of a funny bias where people feel like the more like the older something is, the more historic it is.
Right. If there's no dirt on it, it's not history.
Yeah, exactly. So, like I tell my students, I told my students at UConn on the first day of class that we have to come to think of history not just as the study of the past. It is that. It is the study of the past. But it's also the study of how things come to pass. It's the study of what happened, but it's also the study of why things happened and what other things might have happened. So, history, I guess what I'm trying to say is that to me, history is the study of change over time. And it doesn't matter what event you put under that analytical lens. It can be something that happened 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago or a week ago. But historians are interested in studying things in time. So geographers are going to try to place their events on a map, and historians are going to try to place their events on a calendar. And I think that thinking about causation, why one thing causes another, that is so important a skill to be able to cultivate sort of no matter what year you're looking at.
That was Andy Horowitz, the recently appointed Connecticut State Historian. That segment was produced by Tess Terrible. To see our entire Best of 2023 collection and listen back to the full conversations, you can visit ctpublic.org/where we live. Where We Live is hosted by Catherine Shen and produced by me, Katie Pellico, and Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. You can download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you so much for listening.